January 8, 1815. The Chalmette plantation, 5 miles downriver from New Orleans. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham gave the order that would doom 400 horses and nearly 2,000 men to a death more horrifying than any battlefield wound. British dragoons, the pride of Wellington's Peninsula campaign, spurred their mounts forward across what appeared to be solid ground. Within minutes, the earth itself seemed to come alive. Horses screamed, a sound witnesses would describe as almost human, as the Louisiana bayou opened beneath them like a mouth. Men in scarlet uniforms sank to their waists, then their chests, clawing at cypress roots as American riflemen took position along the elevated levee. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter that unfolded in slow motion, preserved in the mud for 2 centuries. But the truth was far more terrifying than any history textbook would ever admit. Before we uncover the truth about the Battle of New Orleans Cavalry and the swamp that became a mass grave, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history that textbooks try to bury. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into the bayou. December 1814. The United States and Great Britain have been locked in war for over 2 years, a conflict Americans would call the War of 1812, though most of the bloodiest fighting occurred in 1814 and 1815. Napoleon has just abdicated, freeing up 50,000 battle-hardened British troops who terrorized Europe for a decade. The British Empire, mistress of the seas, plans to strangle the young American Republic by seizing New Orleans and controlling the Mississippi River, the commercial artery of the continent. Louisiana in 1815 is barely American. The territory has been part of the United States for only 12 years, purchased from Napoleon in 1803. The population is a volatile mix of French Creoles, Spanish merchants, free people of color, enslaved Africans, Caribbean refugees, and a handful of American settlers. Most residents speak French, not English. Their loyalty to Washington is questionable at best. The landscape itself is hostile to outsiders. The Mississippi Delta is a labyrinth of swamps, bayous, and wetlands that shift with the seasons. What appears to be solid ground in summer becomes quicksand in winter. The locals know which paths to trust, which cypress groves hide sinkholes, which innocent-looking meadows conceal pockets of bottomless muck that the French call tremblant, the trembling earth. British military planners, studying maps in London, see flat terrain perfect for traditional European warfare. They envision neat lines of infantry, cavalry charges, artillery bombardments, the same tactics that defeated Napoleon. What their maps don't show is that the flat terrain is actually a sponge of saturated soil, clay, and decaying vegetation that has accumulated for 10,000 years. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham arrives in Louisiana on December 25, 1814. A Christmas gift no one wanted. He's 37 years old, brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington, and a veteran of the Peninsula War where British discipline crushed French armies. He commands approximately 8,000 troops, including the 1st Royal Dragoons, the 14th Light Dragoons, and the 18th Hussars, cavalry units that represent the pinnacle of military horsemanship. These aren't ordinary soldiers. British dragoons undergo years of training. Each man is paired with a specific horse, usually 17 hands high, bred specifically for warfare. The bond between rider and mount is sacred. Officers treat their horses better than they treat enlisted men. Some of these animals have survived battles across Spain and Portugal. They've heard cannon fire, weathered cavalry charges, navigated mountain passes, but none of them have ever encountered the Louisiana bayou. Opposing Pakenham is Major General Andrew Jackson, a frontier lawyer turned military commander. Jackson is 47, gaunt, perpetually ill from old dueling wounds, and absolutely ruthless. He spent the past weeks fortifying a position along the Rodriguez Canal, a dry irrigation ditch that runs from the Mississippi River to a cypress swamp. His force is a motley collection of regulars, militia, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, and pirates led by John Lafitte. Jackson understands something the British don't. In Louisiana, the land itself is a weapon. Local guides warn Pakenham's officers about the terrain. Jacques Villers, a Creole plantation owner, whose property the British have occupied, tries to explain that the fields between the British position and Jackson's line are faux marais, false marsh. It looks solid, he tells them in broken English, but the earth she does not hold a man, certainly not a horse. The British dismiss him. They've conquered half the world. They're not going to be lectured by colonial farmers about tactics. On January 7th, Pakenham calls his final council of war. The plan is straightforward, a direct assault along the eastern bank of the Mississippi, with cavalry positioned to exploit any breakthrough in the American line. The dragoons will wait behind the main infantry assault, then charge through once the American defenses collapse. It's a textbook European battle plan. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins, who will lead one of the assault columns, voices concern about the terrain. "Sir, the scouts report unusual ground conditions." Pakenham cuts him off. "The ground is flat and firm enough for our purposes. We've marched across worse in Spain. But Spain doesn't have the Mississippi Delta. Spain doesn't have soil that remembers every drop of rain that's fallen for 10 millennia. January 1st, 1815. A week before the main assault, British forces conduct reconnaissance in force. Captain Henry Travers of the 14th Light Dragoons leads a patrol of 30 mounted men toward the American line. The morning fog is thick, locals call it brouillard de marais, swamp fog, and visibility drops to 20 feet. Travers keeps his men to what appears to be a cattle path, slightly elevated above the surrounding fields. They advance slowly. The horses sense something wrong. They toss their heads, fight the bit, flatten their ears. Travers's own mount, a bay gelding that carried him through 3 years of peninsula campaigns without hesitation, suddenly plants his feet and refuses to move forward. Travers dismounts to investigate. He takes 3 steps off the path and sinks to his knees. The suction is immediate and powerful. His sergeant pulls him back, but Travers's boots remain in the muck, swallowed completely. "What in God's name is this?" Travers mutters, staring at his stockinged feet. They return to camp and report the incident. The engineer corps conducts a survey. Their conclusion: isolated soft spots, nothing that would impede a major operation. The engineers are from Yorkshire. They've never seen soil that behaves like liquid while still appearing solid. January 3rd. A supply column attempts to move artillery closer to the American line. 6 horses are harnessed to a 12-pound cannon. The gun weighs 1,400 pounds, and the carriage adds another 1,000. The horses have pulled heavier loads across Spanish mountains. They make it 50 yards into the field before the lead pair begins to sink. The driver whips them forward, the worst possible decision. The horses panic, lunging against their harnesses, which only drives them deeper into the saturated earth. Within 3 minutes, all 6 animals are mired to their bellies, thrashing in terror. It takes 2 hours and 40 men to extract them. They have to unharness each horse individually, lay planks beneath them, and literally winch them out using block and tackle. 2 horses suffer torn ligaments and have to be destroyed. The cannon is abandoned, sinking a full foot into the ground overnight. Captain John Cook, an artillery officer, writes in his diary that night, "The earth here possesses a malevolent quality. It appears solid, yet devours weight. I've seen nothing like it in 20 years of service. The men are beginning to speak of cursed ground." The soldiers aren't entirely wrong. The local Choctaw have stories about this land. They call it Hatak Chafa, ground that eats men. There are legends of entire hunting parties disappearing, of warriors who stepped into seemingly shallow water and never resurfaced. The French and Spanish who settled here learned to respect these warnings. They built on elevated ground, used pilings, never trusted the earth. The British assume it's all superstition. January 5th. 3 days before the assault, Pakenham orders a night reconnaissance. Lieutenant William Gleig of the 85th Regiment leads 40 men on foot across the fields. They carry ropes, measure distances, mark artillery positions. At 2:00 a.m. the patrol is crossing what appears to be a dry drainage ditch when Private Samuel Morris, bringing up the rear, suddenly shouts. The men turn to see Morris sinking rapidly into the earth. Not into water, into the ground itself. The surface shows no hole, no depression. Morris is simply being drawn downward as if the earth is inhaling him. 4 men grab his arms. Age. A killing ground disguised as farmland. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The horror is just beginning, and what happens next changed how military strategists think about terrain forever. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Now let's discover what happened when 2,000 men and 400 horses marched into the earth's open mouth. January 8, 1815, 6:30 a.m. The sky is overcast, the ground fog thick enough that men can't see 50 feet. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Every surface drips with condensation. Pakenham gives the order. 8,000 British soldiers begin to advance across the Chalmette plain. The infantry moves first. The 93rd Highlanders, the 21st Royal Scots Fusiliers, the 44th East Essex, regiment after regiment stepping off in perfect formation. The first 100 yards go smoothly. The soldiers maintain their lines, muskets at the ready. Then the ground changes. Lieutenant George Gleig, advancing with the 85th, describes it in his memoirs. The earth beneath our feet ceased to be solid. Each step required effort, as if walking through thick porridge. Men began to separate from their formations not from cowardice, but because maintaining line required firm footing we no longer possessed. The soldiers are now 75 yards from the American line. They can see the earthworks, the cotton bales Jackson's men have piled for protection, the glint of rifle barrels. They're expecting return fire. Instead, they hear laughter. The American riflemen, positioned on the elevated Rodriguez Canal levee, have a perfect view of the British struggle. They watch red-coated soldiers stumble, slip, fall to their knees in the muck. Some of Jackson's Kentucky long riflemen are placing bets on which British soldier will fall next. Jackson himself stands behind the line, watching through a telescope. He turns to his aide and says, "They're doing exactly what I hoped. The fools are fighting the bayou, not us." At 7:00 a.m., Pakenham realizes the infantry assault is failing. Entire companies have ground to a halt, men struggling just to stay upright. The American defensive fire hasn't even begun in earnest, but the British advance has already lost all momentum. He makes the decision that will define the battle. He orders the cavalry forward. The 1st Royal Dragoons receive the order first. 400 mounted men, arranged in 3 lines, begin to advance. Their horses are massive, 17 to 18 hands, weighing 1,200 to 1,500 pounds each. Every step presses down with enormous force. For the first 50 yards it seems to work. The horses move faster than the infantry. They overtake the struggling foot soldiers, splashing through standing water, hooves throwing up great gouts of mud. Then they reach the zone. Captain Thomas Mullins, riding with the lead squadron, describes what happens next in a letter that won't be published until 1857. "The ground simply ceased to exist beneath us. One moment my mount was cantering across what appeared to be wet pasture. The next he was chest-deep in earth that behaved like water. He didn't stumble into a hole. The surface gave way uniformly, as if the earth itself was swallowing him. Horses began to sink, not 1 or 2, but dozens simultaneously. 150 animals drop into the saturated soil in less than 3 minutes. The sound is overwhelming. Horses screaming, men shouting, the wet sucking noise of tons of animal flesh being drawn into mud. The horses panic. A panicked horse weighs 1,500 pounds of pure muscle. When they thrash, they sink faster. When they try to lunge forward, they drive themselves deeper. Their hooves find no purchase. There's nothing beneath them but 10 feet of saturated clay and organic sludge that has no bottom, no solidity, nothing to push against. Lieutenant William Pratt watches his horse, a gray stallion named Tempest that survived 4 years of PE, Peninsula War, sink to his shoulders in 90 seconds. Pratt tries to dismount, but his boot catches in the stirrup. He's pulled sideways into the muck. He finally tears free, leaving his boot, his sword, and his horse behind. Tempest is still sinking, still screaming. The 2nd and 3rd Cavalry lines, seeing the disaster ahead, try to halt, but momentum and the press of horses behind them drives them forward. Mounts collide, stumble, go down. Once down, they can't rise. The mud holds them like concrete. By 7:15 a.m., 380 horses are trapped in a kill zone, roughly 200 yards wide and 400 yards long. The American riflemen, who have been watching this catastrophe unfold, now open fire. Kentucky long rifles, accurate to 300 yards in the hands of expert marksmen, begin picking off British cavalry officers. The Americans don't shoot the horses first, they shoot the riders. A mounted man presents a larger target. Once the rider falls, the horse is effectively neutralized, trapped in the mud. Sergeant William Lawrence of the Tennessee Militia later testifies, "It wasn't sporting, it was execution. The lobsterbacks couldn't move, couldn't take cover. They just sat there on their horses sinking slowly, while we reloaded and fired at our leisure. Some of them were still alive when the mud reached their chests." British officers try to rally their men. Major Thomas Wilkinson rides back and forth along the edge of the kill zone, shouting orders, trying to find firm ground. A rifle ball takes him in the throat. He falls from his horse, landing face first in standing water. His mount, freed of his weight, actually manages to extract itself and flees back toward British lines. By 7:30 a.m., organized British resistance has collapsed. The infantry, watching their cavalry being slaughtered, begins to retreat without orders. Pakenham himself rides forward to stop the rout. A rifle ball shatters his left arm. Another hits his left thigh. A third, fired by a free man of color from New Orleans named Pompey, strikes him in the spine. Pakenham falls from his horse. He bleeds out in 3 minutes, dying in the same mud that's swallowing his cavalry. The battle is over by 8:00 a.m. It lasted 90 minutes. What remains in the Chalmette plain is a scene from hell. 400 horses are trapped in the mud, some buried to their necks, some completely submerged. 2,000 British soldiers lie dead or wounded across the field. The American casualties total 13 killed and 39 wounded. It's not a battle. It's a natural disaster disguised as warfare. January 9, 1815, dawn. British forces remain in position, stunned by the magnitude of their defeat. They've lost their commanding general, most of their senior officers, and nearly a quarter of their fighting force. But what horrifies them most is the sound coming from the battlefield. The horses are still alive. Over 200 animals remain trapped in the mud, unable to move, unable to die quickly. They've been there for over 24 hours. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees overnight. The horses are suffering from hypothermia, exhaustion, and sheer terror. Their cries echo across the plain, a sound that soldiers on both sides will hear in nightmares for the rest of their lives. Major General John Lambert, now in command of British forces, faces an impossible decision. The horses are technically on neutral ground between the two armies. Any rescue attempt would expose his men to American fire. But listening to the animals scream is destroying morale faster than any defeat. He requests a temporary truce. Jackson surprisingly agrees. At 10:00 a.m. on January 9th, men from both armies venture onto the battlefield under a white flag. What they find is worse than any of them imagined. Surgeon William Dunlop, attached to the 89th Regiment, writes in his diary, "The mud had transformed into something beyond description. The horses hadn't simply sunk. They'd been absorbed. Some animals were buried to their eyes, their heads the only visible portion, surrounded by hoof prints filled with water and blood. Others had sunk completely, leaving only disturbed earth to mark their location. The living and the dead were impossible to distinguish without close examination. The rescue parties try to extract the horses. They use ropes, pulleys, teams of men pulling in coordination. It takes 20 men 30 minutes to extract a single horse, and most of those horses have to be destroyed immediately anyway. Their legs broken, their muscles torn, their lungs filled with mud." Private Thomas Morris of the 73rd Regiment describes the process. "We'd get ropes around a horse's chest and pull. British military property, representing thousands of pounds in value. Families of dead cavalry officers sue the British Army for the value of their personal mounts. Many officers purchased their own horses at significant expense. The British government initially denies the claims, arguing the horses were lost in combat. But they weren't lost in combat. They were lost to terrain that British command knew, or should have known, was hazardous." In 1817, a parliamentary inquiry examines the disaster. Testimony reveals that multiple warnings about ground conditions were ignored. The Engineer Corps survey that dismissed the danger was conducted by men with no experience in tropical or subtropical environments. The British Army had treated Louisiana like Spain, applying European warfare doctrine to American geography. The inquiry concludes with a remarkable statement: "The defeat at New Orleans was not a military failure but a geographical one. We sent cavalry to charge across ground that could not support human passage. We did so despite warnings. The loss of life, human and animal, represents a failure of intelligence and judgment. No one is court-martialed. Pakenham is dead. Lambert is reassigned. The cavalry officers who survived are deemed to have followed orders. But the British Army changes. New regulations require environmental surveys before any major operation. Officer training begins to include geology and hydrology. The disaster at New Orleans creates an entire field of military science, terrain analysis. The horses become a footnote. Official histories mention cavalry losses without elaboration. The 400 animals that died in the mud are reduced to a single sentence in most accounts. British cavalry forces were unable to exploit battlefield opportunities due to adverse ground conditions. The Battle of New Orleans changed warfare forever, though not in the way most historians discuss. The standard narrative focuses on Andrew Jackson's victory, American nationalism, the futility of fighting a battle after peace was signed. But military strategists learned a darker lesson. Nature is a more effective weapon than any artillery. Within 5 years of the battle, every major military academy in Europe adds coursework on environmental warfare. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing on war in the 1820s, dedicates an entire chapter to terrain as combatant, the idea that geography can kill as efficiently as gunfire. The British Army conducts a secret study of every major defeat in its history where environmental factors contributed to losses. The list is longer than anyone expected: Jamestown Colony, the Cartagena Expedition, the Saratoga Campaign, and now New Orleans. A pattern emerges. British forces trained in temperate climates consistently underestimate the lethality of foreign environments. This leads to the creation of the Royal Engineers Geographic Section in 1824, tasked with studying climate, soil, and hydrology of every region where British forces might deploy. Officers begin carrying soil testing kits. Before any major operation, engineers spend weeks probing ground density, measuring water tables, identifying quicksand risks. The Americans, meanwhile, turned the Battle of New Orleans into propaganda. But they learned their own lessons. When the U.S. military expands westward in the 1830s and 40s, they encounter new terrain challenges: deserts, mountains, canyons. The memory of British cavalry drowning in Louisiana mud makes commanders cautious. During the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, American forces advancing across the Valley of Mexico encountered chanampas, artificial islands in a lake bed. The terrain is structurally similar to the Louisiana bayou, a thin layer of solid earth over water and mud. American commanders, remembering New Orleans, refuse to commit cavalry. They lose time but save lives. The broader implications extend beyond military strategy. The New Orleans disaster for C.S. a reckoning with how Western civilization understands land itself. European agricultural science up to this point treats soil as inert material. It's categorized by color and texture, sandy, loamy, clay, but not by structural integrity. The idea that ground could behave like liquid, could swallow heavy objects while appearing solid, challenges fundamental assumptions. Starting in the 1820s, geologists begin studying problem soils. They discover that New Orleans isn't unique. Coastal wetlands worldwide contain similar liquefaction zones: the Ganges Delta in India, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, the Mississippi River floodplain, all harbor ground that can transform from solid to liquid under pressure. This knowledge saves lives. Engineers building canals, railroads, and cities in the 19th century begin conducting soil stability tests. The Panama Canal Project 1881-1914 employs geologists specifically to identify liquefaction risks. When the canal experiences massive landslides in 1907, killing hundreds of workers, investigators find the slides occurred in zones similar to the Chalmette Plain. Saturated soil that collapsed under its own weight. The environmental lessons reach another dark conclusion: the earth itself can be weaponized. During World War I, both sides experiment with flooding battlefields to create impassable terrain. The Germans flood portions of the Western Front in 1917, creating mud zones that swallow tanks and horses. British forces at Passchendaele, Third Battle of Ypres, advance through mud so deep that wounded men drown in shell craters filled with liquefied earth. Over 30,000 British Empire soldiers die in the mud, more casualties than the entire Battle of New Orleans, spread across 4 months instead of 90 minutes. The parallels are explicit. British veterans read accounts of the New Orleans cavalry disaster and see their own experiences reflected. Lieutenant Colonel W. N. Nicholson, who served at Passchendaele, writes in 1928, "We learned nothing. 100 years after Louisiana, we sent men to fight in conditions we knew were lethal. The mud didn't care about our tactics or training. It swallowed us the same way it swallowed Pakenham's dragoons." But perhaps the most disturbing implication is what the Battle of New Orleans reveals about institutional memory and human psychology. The British Army knew the ground was dangerous. They received multiple warnings. They witnessed preliminary incidents: horses sinking during reconnaissance, artillery pieces getting stuck, soldiers reporting unstable earth. They had local guides who explained the terrain hazards, and they attacked anyway. Why? Because acknowledging the danger would have required changing the plan. It would have required admitting that their standard tactics that conquered much of the world, didn't apply in Louisiana. It would have required humility. Pride killed 2,000 men and 400 horses at New Orleans. Not British pride or American pride, but human pride, the assumption that will and discipline can overcome physical reality. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Charge of the Light Brigade 1854, the Pickett's Charge 1863, the Somme 1916, instances where commanders knowingly sent men into death traps because changing plans would mean admitting mistakes. Modern military doctrine has a term for this: commitment bias. Once a plan is set, once resources are dedicated, commanders resist changing course even when new information suggests the original plan is flawed. The Battle of New Orleans becomes a case study in this phenomenon, taught at West Point and Sandhurst as an example of how cognitive bias kills. The Chalmette battlefield today is a National Historical Park, part of the Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve. Tourists walk across the field where the British cavalry died, usually without knowing what lies beneath their feet. In 1965, during construction of a visitor center, workers excavating a foundation hit something solid 8 feet down. They unearthed a complete horse skeleton, still wearing remnants of cavalry tack. Carbon dating confirmed it was from 1815. The skeleton showed signs of multiple fractures, legs broken during desperate attempts to escape the mud. The National Park Service quietly relocated the skeleton to storage and chose not to mention it in official park materials. They discovered 2 more horse skeletons during drainage work in 1978 and another 5 during a pipeline installation in 1993. Each time, the remains were catalogued and stored without public announcement. Why the secrecy? Because acknowledging how many horses remain buried would require acknowledging the full horror of what happened. It would mean confronting the fact that the battlefield is, essentially, a mass grave for animals who died in ways that violate modern sensibilities about humane treatment. In 2003, ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies consistent with large buried objects across approximately 40 acres of the battlefield. Conservative estimates suggest 75 to 100 horses remain buried, along with an unknown number of soldiers who sank too deep to be recovered. The earth keeps its dead. What drove General Pakenham to order that cavalry charge? Was it arrogance, desperation, or something darker? The institutional momentum of an empire that couldn't admit its tactics had limitations. Some historians argue Pakenham genuinely didn't understand the terrain. He'd fought across Europe, where soil is stable and predictable. Louisiana was alien to him, a landscape that defied everything he'd been trained to expect. Others suggest he knew the risks, but felt he had no choice. His orders were to capture New Orleans. His career, his reputation, his family honor. Everything depended on victory. The mud was a problem to overcome, not a reason to retreat. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible. Pakenham sent the cavalry forward because stopping would have meant accepting defeat. And defeat was unthinkable. 400 horses paid the price for that pride. So did 2,000 men. The next time you hear hoofbeats, remember the Chalmette plain. Remember that beneath the earth we walk on, the past remains. Sometimes it remains alive, trapped and screaming, for longer than we'd like to believe. What do you think? Could Pakenham have avoided this disaster, or was it inevitable the moment British forces landed in Louisiana? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you know of other battles where the environment proved more deadly than the enemy, share those stories too. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of American history, the stories that textbooks bury as deep as those horses in the bayou. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. The earth remembers what we forget, and sometimes it makes us pay for that amnesia. See you in the next video.